Okay, so it is Friday, the 21st, and I'm Rich Westman, the chair of the Transportation Committee, and we're going to resume our testimony with the agency. And Jeremy, if you introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Jeremy Reed, the Chief Engineer for the Agency of Transportation, here this morning to discuss S29, the chloride bill. I'll just sort of start the conversation with saying I'm not sure how relevant this conversation is going to be, because I understand there's sort of overlapping testimony in the Senate that may change the bill. But the version of the bill I have, I can basically say we are basically on board. We don't have any objections with the version that is draft number 3.2, with the exception of there's some language on page 5, and I'm not sure if you have a version of the bill, but basically it requests that we report on summer dust suppression, so calcium chloride for dust control, basically. And just to give you an idea, why we oppose that is that it's just a administrative headache for so very little chloride. In round numbers, we will spread 130,000 tons of salt for winter and ice control, and we'll spread somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300 tons for dust suppression here. So it's not even in kind of a rounding error type thing. And why that's sort of an administrative headache for us is the way we advertise construction projects is there's two ways that we pay for dust control. One is we'll have a contract item, and that's on some of the longer linear roadway projects where we expect the quantity to be higher. And we actually pay contractors per ton for whatever dust suppression they use. On the overwhelming majority of our contracts, though, it's just subsidiary to every other item. And they'll just take, a 50-pound bag or a 100-pound bag and sprinkle it on maybe an access entrance or something like that. And so for us to track that would be probably the way we'd have to change the way we do it and include it as a contract pay item for every contract, which again, at that point, we're creating essentially administrative effort to track something that costs almost nothing and contributes almost nothing to the total chloride. The other point I would make on that.
How many contracts do we let out for chloride?
I don't know how many. I can tell you this. So I pulled out how much we paid for dust suppression for calcium chloride going back to 2019. And so in successive years, in 2019, we used 3.84 tons. In 2020, we used 133.8 tons. 21, we used 470.5 tons. 22, we used 267.6 tons. 23, 285.6 tons, and 24, 95.5 tons. So that's going to be 80% of the dust suppression that is actually out there, because those are the big projects in which we actually pay for it separately. On top of that, there may be like 1 ton or less that is those 50 to 100-pound bags spread out across the other projects randomly. So again, we don't know exactly how much chloride we put out there, but it's certainly averages less than 300 ton a year. So to the other point I wanted to make, just the nature of how we spread calcium chloride for dust suppression makes it less likely to enter surface waters and ultimately go into the waterways, because we're spreading it on what is, it won't be a totally pervious surface, but it's significantly more pervious than pavement, which is the targeted application. And the granular size is significantly smaller. So typically rock salt, it's like almost 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch. Calcium chloride is significantly smaller. It'll be going on to a fairly dry gravel surface and essentially be absorbed right into that. And it won't be washed off into stormwater conveyances and into waterways at that point. So not only is the quantity significantly less, but it has no direct conduit into stormwater receiving or surface waterways in general.
Use most of the chloride for dust suppression, but like on construction sites.
Yeah, it'll be generally like long linear construction sites where the traffic's kind of stirring it up. Or right at the entrance of maybe a staging area where trucks will be kind of pulling in and stuff like that before they spread out into the staging area. There'll be what we call a stabilized construction entrance, and it may be in that type area. But it's a very small magnitude in relative terms.
So I think it's Michael Grady that's the drafts person for the bill across. Can you touch base with Mike and have him bring something back to us to consider?
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know how relevant this is because I do believe ANR is going to propose some changes and
ANR did propose changes.
Okay.
One of the things that they, the thing that I'm most aware that they proposed, and I don't know how the committee across the hall is going to dealt with municipal salt sheds and not requiring that they be covered.
Right.
I don't know the extent of everything that they proposed, but that was in the list.
Right. And they took out the dust suppression.
And they said dust. So I don't know what they are thinking with any, but it would be helpful to us if we had some proposed language, and then we would have discussions with the committee across the hall and talk about it in here to see what we think.
Okay, I think I have spoken to Chair Watson, and originally she had no qualms with this. I'm not sure if it was purposely omitted or just got dropped or whatever, but we'll continue to work with her to make sure that the final language at least has our considerations, and if not, we'll certainly come
Yeah,
back.
we've been going back and forth
Okay.
almost daily with her
Okay.
about the progress being made
Okay.
or not made here.
Right.
And I will say this for the committee, if the bill, because it gets backed up for crossover, it would be my recommendation that if we had some small changes, we just would amend it on the floor.
Okay.
If there's not, if there are a number of changes and it doesn't slow it up, we might try to take the bill for a day. But I don't want to hold the bill up at any level to do that. And the chair of the Natural Resources Committee and I have been having those discussions back and forth. That's why if something like this, if it's on a list, and she's very aware that the area that we've shown quite a lot of interest is if we do go ahead with a deadline for covering municipal salt and sand piles, that we have some comfort level on where they might access money. So, but that's, go ahead.
Well, you can, I just want to ask a question before we're done.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, especially if it's the only time that we're going to have this, which is fine.
Well, we're definitely gonna, it's on our schedule to talk about on Tuesday, the bill.
Okay.
And I'm trying to get everything that we might talk about, so we have a comfort level of where we are in relationship with the bill, but it's going to be on our schedule on Tuesday.
Okay, so I have received a couple comments from constituents about why do the towns have this? Why isn't the state doing it? But my understanding is the state, VTrans is following all these regulations and will continue to follow these, or not, maybe they're not regulations, but these methods.
Right. So I don't want to sort of get into the sort of maintenance too much, but I would say that we have a snow and ice control plan that, very explicitly states how we use chlorides in that snow and ice control usage. And we do track how much chlorides we put down on an annual basis. And that's how I know roughly on average, we use 130,000 tons.
Okay.
So I think that's the distinction is to some degree, we're already doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And you're doing it in an environmentally sensitive
Correct.
way. Okay.
Yeah, I
I
think,
just think it's important for the public to know. that.
right. And I think one of the factoids that I've been given in the past is, you know, when we're going down the interstate, we spread basically 300 pounds of salt per mile. So literally like a wheelbarrow over the course of a mile is a typical application, right?
For the one time
Yeah.
application. Okay. Thank you.
Do you ever talk about what dust control methods they use? You just leave it up to them because they don't have to use calcium chloride.
Yeah, so there's certainly they would rather use water and that's the first go-to, but when that's not a viable option for any number of reasons, this is what their fallback would be. So I think this is not their primary method for dust control. It would be water or you know.
There are other materials, but
Right, so I think, you know, this is again, those larger sites, long linear projects with heavier traffic counts is where we use calcium chloride principally.
All right, next subject.
Thanks. Yeah. Here. Yeah.
No.
pavement. We're talking about pavement now. Get ready.
I'm not ready.
That's why I'm giving you a warning.
I'm on the road. In fact, I'm a little worried the road might be bumpy, so I would lay down.
I'm trying to pave the way.
Oh.
You're trying to fade away. You're good.
No.
So I know I'm trying to get these back. You have to do that for every time.
I think we're ready anytime you are.
So this is some testimony that's been sought after that basically is trying to be forward looking and predict what the network conditions will be at current funding levels in the out years. And so what we did is we focused on two principal components which have the largest composition, and that is paving and bridges. I do want to, you know, highlight though that this does not address a number of areas, which would be long linear roadway projects like 22A, finishing Tab Danville, Pittsford Brandon, Route 78 in Swanton as an example. So this is certainly not looking at those projects. This also does not look at culverts that may be less than 6 feet, that when we replace them would probably be in excess of 6 feet just due to new standards. And this does not address the rough cuts that we have out there. As you may know, I think over the last 15 to 18 months, we've had to close the interstate on 3 separate occasions due to rock falls. And so we try to address those projects within our roadway budget. So the roadway budget encapsulates a bunch of stuff, and those 3 items, the long linear roadway projects, the rock falls and culverts could potentially be in there.
So I just say to you and understand because we're kind of live here and not anybody probably is listening. If they wanted to come back and listen to it, it's really hard when you sit in these chairs and you don't deal with this every day. And when we talk outside of this room to be able to, when you hear that paving budget is dropping from something over 200 miles a year that we're paving to 123 miles as is being suggested in the budget. There's a turnover time and a rotation to all of this. And, you know, we need to be able to understand, to be able to talk to our colleagues about what that means what it means is the pavement condition, what that will do in that, and to help us quantify where we are and what we're doing.
Sure.
So that, my goal in this would be in bridges, in pavement, focus, because those are two of the biggest,
Yep.
that you create an understanding so we can articulate it to our colleagues.
I will do my best and certainly, and not that this needs saying, but please jump in and ask questions as we go through the presentation if we want to get into more details. So I just want to first start about how we assess the roadway condition. So we collect essentially the ride, which is sort of the smoothness of the road, any rutting, and cracking, which we'll call structural and environmental. So structural will be the pavement itself is failing. Environmental is just cracking due to either frost heaving or just natural shrinkage and expansion of the pavement due to temperature. So we do this across the entire network. We get 64,000 data points at 0.05 of a mile increments. We do the entire network every 2 years, and we do the NHS, so that's interstates, Route 2, Route 78, Route 4, things like that, every year. And so we're able to collect all of that information at least on a 2-year interval.
Do you always do it in the same month?
No, I don't.
Just you kind of, or the same season?
Yeah, we do it in the summer.
Teams would-
Right. Yeah, we do it in the summer, so there won't be any active heaving or anything like that.
Yeah.
So after we collect all that data, it basically gives us a score, which is called the Pavement Composite Index. And essentially we take those 4 distress indices and average them out. We then can come up with the composite index by punching the numbers into the equation that you see on the right, and that gives us a total pavement score for that section of roadway.
So, good question. So do they each have the same scale so that one is, okay.
Yes. So that pavement condition is then that's your PCI, and basically the way we classify this is good is 80 to 100, fair is 65 to 80, poor is 40 to 65, and very poor is under 40. Now this is a little bit of a deviation from what Federal Highway requires, so they just use good, fair, poor. But for the purposes of us programming projects and having more precision, we have a more detailed analysis. We do simplify it and send it to them as required, but we certainly feel our data is more reflective of the actual conditions out there and provides a little bit more detail. How
Is your simplification just putting very poor in the poor?
Yeah, the Federal Highway sort of scoring is just good, fair, and poor.
It's just under 65 is poor.
I don't know what their numbers are. I think it's a little bit different, but they only have the 3 categories.
Going back, maybe you've been around for a while.
Yeah. Well, it depends what a while means.
I'm gonna go back, say 15 years. At one time, didn't we roll very poor into poor? I mean, and the reason I say that is because we were in such bad shape.
Mhm.
Chairman Westman days, and then I followed.
That was my fault.
Yeah.
No,
What I would say is I inherited big time bridge problems, and now it seems I'm inheriting. I mean, every time they put me in one of these chairs, it's not good.
well, it's so you can fix it.
Oh, great.
So, but I thought I recalled we were in such bad shape back then that we didn't really want to have a very poor category because it was huge.
Yes, it was. So I'm pulling it from memory, but I think I have seen very poor as high as like 28 or 30% of the network.
Yeah,
But it's bad.
it was bridges were
Worse.
worse
Right.
back then.
Right. But yeah, I think, and I'm gonna get my years wrong, but I do think if we go back to like 2005, 6 timeframe,
Yeah.
it was about 28 to 30% very
Yeah,
poor.
that was the time.
Also, you know, you might ask, why don't we just use 25-point increments? And we actually did probably just before that time frame. What we did is we did kind of a user survey and we took them out and told them basically rate this road good, fair, poor, or very poor. And we knew what the number was and we asked them sort of what their subjective feeling was. And this is largely the byproduct of that. So anything out of 40, they considered very poor as opposed to like a 25. So that's why the numbers isn't.
That's great.
evenly
So you
distributed.
calibrated.
Exactly, to the user experience. So these are just some pictures of what those classifications could look like. Obviously, the top left is pretty new and, you know, basically a pristine roadway. Fair is pretty good with some structural cracks there. You can see pores starting to open up a little bit. And then obviously the very poor is heavily cracked and obviously you got some mudding as well.
When does the water get down through it?
Well, your first crack in theory allows the water to get in. And then 3 saw cycles opens that crack up. So this is what we are now projecting for the network condition based on a $103 million budget. So you can see today the very poor percentage is about 6%, and we expect that to grow over time to upwards of 48% at current funding levels. The travel weighted average, which is, as I've discussed, you take that index and you multiply it by the number of vehicles, and essentially that gives you kind of a more weighted representation of the roadway condition. Our target for that is 70, and we will be dropping below that and staying below that as a projected
So
target.
you just, so the line is at 28%?
25.
25%.
Yeah, so our target's no more than 25% of the roadway is in very poor condition, and the travel weighted average we want to be above 70.
So just to make it clear, we're gonna go from like 26% poor or very poor to by 2029, the estimate is to go to 60%.
No. So today we're at roughly 6%.
No, he's saying.
Oh, poor and very
Very
poor, correct.
poor.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, correct.
Okay, so we're gonna go from about 26% to 60% poor or very.
Which is very scary. Oh, sorry.
Which is very poor.
I say very scary, yeah.
I'm just saying, you know, just
Yeah.
go ahead and
And what is the happening that did the good and the very poor expand, but the very poor shrink? Can you explain why that would be?
I think it's because we would continue to keep the good roads good, right, with preventative maintenance. And the worst of the worst would continue to grow because those treatments are more expensive, so we can do less of them. I think that's intuitively the byproduct there.
go ahead.
That was my question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No,
I think you.
Yeah, whichever-
Well, but.
You
yeah,
guys
that's
fight it out.
really
You
interesting.
guys fight it out.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on what Andy said, that's really interesting because I know sometimes you do that in pavement where you don't fix the worst one first because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, you cannot just pave the worst roads.
Yeah.
Right? Because basically by not maintaining it, those good roads deteriorate faster
Yeah.
and it then introduces a much more expensive treatment.
So if we get to that situation, that could really cause conflict
Right.
between towns and areas.
And what I would say is that basically what we do is we put in all the constraints, right? We have deterioration models. We just barely updated them last year through research project. And we put in the funding constraints, and BMS, which is our asset management software, runs upwards of 30,000 iterations each year to find out the right people at the right road to get the best outcome given these two targets. And then that's how we build our program.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So you actually have it on the next slide, more so what I'm hoping to address, but I'm surprised to see, I kind of wish we had the previous years on this as well, because what I'm kind of struggling with is just the sheer amount of money we dumped into paving in 2022 and 2023. Like, I believe about like $20 million more than we had in previous years, if not more. But to still see this kind of decline happening only a few years later is kind of shocking. And I don't really, it's just surprising to me. You'd think if we spent that amount of money over and above what we had ever previously spent, that we would be seeing a longer term preservation of our pavement conditions. But I'm wondering if and I thought maybe the reason was because we weren't getting a bang for our buck. Like, we had the money, but we just weren't paving as many miles. But your next chart says that we did pave over 337 miles. So I'm trying to rationalize and understand if we invested all that money and we had paved way more miles, it's either that, and this is just me trying to logic it out, so tell me if I'm wrong, but we either paved more miles, like we added additional road miles. So we've kind of created the problem for ourselves where we have more road miles than ever before. So obviously more to degrade quicker over time, more road miles.
Yeah, we have not expanded the network. I mean, we built the Morristown bypass and that's it. The network's basically been static since.
It's 10 years old.
Right. But I mean, that's my point. We didn't get an influx of money and start paving things that historically we haven't paved.
Okay, so it's not that there are more road miles that need to be paved and that's the cause of this. It's truly that I guess I'm misunderstanding why we would still see this after such an increased influx of
Sure.
this.
So paving is very reactive given its short life cycle to what you've done recently. So yes, in 2023, we spent $158 million. That was the paving program. But if you just say the rough life cycle of pavement is 10 years, this is the byproduct of that, right? So within 7 years of that, you're seeing those come to the end of their useful life.
So it almost seems like paving is kind of a bad investment, because it degrades so quickly and doesn't really have I understand why we pave things, I really do, but it does seem like we need to have a holistic conversation as a state. As we continue to see no advocacy for more revenue, we're just gonna have to be paving less, based on where we're at with no alternative. And the amount of millions of dollars we threw at it isn't giving us long-term sustainability on our network. So I have a lot of serious concerns about advocating for upping our paving road miles, but we're not seeing long-term investments play out to the benefit of Vermonters. So I guess I think the point that you're making is we need to put more revenue into it. But what we saw when we did put a lot more revenue into it wasn't long-term benefit. So I guess I don't.
Well, I guess I would sort of disagree with that. I mean, by design, paving isn't going to last 40 years like a bridge. I mean, it has a finite life cycle, and that's not a goal, but that's just the nature of the material. And so I don't think it's really fair to say we're not seeing any long-term benefit, because if we went back to 2019 and said, okay, we're going to pave $110 million a year, $120 million a year, the current graph of 2025 of 43% in good and only 6% in very poor would look vastly different. And, yes, at the end of its design life, it's going to fail. And that's totally expected. And that's why we can predict what's going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years.
I think what makes me struggle with this conversation is we hear so often that we can't meet our carbon emissions reductions requirements, that they're not possible because the cost is so great. But then when it comes to quality of pavement, we are so willing to throw millions of dollars at it without seeing long-term savings. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no savings that we're getting from any of this investment is what I'm picking up on based on the sheer amount of investment we made. So it just seems like we need to have a real conversation about, is the amount of miles we're paving benefiting us as a society? And I think the answer's up in the air. At least I haven't heard it compelling.
Well, I guess I would answer that with, it's the worst option except all the others.
Like democracy.
Right. Right. I mean, if somebody has a better idea.
Or having less paving because people are driving less on our roads, or reducing their road miles, or having lighter vehicles, or bike and pedestrian, like that seems like a much better investment to me. But because I'm not seeing that when we paved 337 miles in 2022 and having any kind of, it just doesn't seem to be moving the dial even when we
Yeah.
go that high. Like it's an endless pit where we could throw money versus transitioning away from having to do that sheer amount of paving.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
That's the-
this investment is always a possibility, and if you have ideas on which roads we shouldn't pave, or we can sort of allow them to become very poor or worse, I think we can have that conversation. But I think that's probably not acceptable outcome to most of our travelers.
So
Yeah, I mean,
go Pat, and then I've got a couple of questions.
so one suggestion would be to just eliminate paving in the southern part of the state.
You're talking
For a
like-
while.
No.
See how that works out, but, no, I mean, my take on it is you did pave 337 miles in 2022. But you only paved 157 in 2020, 247, 100 miles less. And then in the following year, in 2023, you're 100 less, thereabouts. In order to see those numbers where they should be, I think the fact is we should be paving 300 miles at least every year. And then you'd see those numbers change. You're not going to get the results by just giving it a 337 mile slug in 1 year and then slack off of the years before and the years after. And then this year we're way down. I mean, this is scary for here. $103 million in 2026 is, what's that paving? 120 miles.
Yeah.
That chart's gonna need, is that? Yeah, okay, that's funny. So
I'm gonna follow that up. Turnaround time at 103. What is our cycle to say that to go back and do the system? If I'm at 300 miles a year and I did it consistently for a time, how many years between paving of each road, knowing that
Right.
some roads we don't pave
Right.
every, the lower traveled roads. In my area, Route 109 would be, not as much as
Right.
15
Right.
in it, but give us a sense of the turnaround time, based upon this that we're looking at.
Sure. So if we paved 300 miles a year, which I think this building's heard repeatedly, we've got roughly 3,200 miles of roadway. So that is basically 10 years. That would, obviously be an average because class one, Perry City and Montclair and Burlington, maybe more frequently, just given the volumes of traffic. Where I live on Route 12, certainly is not going to be paved every 10 years, right? But that's the rough math of it.
So, and at the 200-mile level, we're probably talking 15.
15.
But then if you get into the question, my larger question, if I'm at 60% of the roads that are poor or very poor, the treatment to bring those roads back becomes much greater because I've had, if I think, in my lay simple terms, I think of the road like a roof.
Yep.
And if you start to leak down in, then you have to rip up the base and you do it. How can I quantify how much more the treatments are
Sure.
that and what that does to this system if I
Right.
say we decided we were going to go out and take 500 miles off from the statewide system. Even doing that, if I'm falling this far behind, I've got roads that when I get around to treating them are going to be way more expensive to do.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
that
So, the best way I can answer this is like this: the pavement preservation treatment, the sort of keeping the good road good type of approach. That in round numbers, we'll just say is $300,000 to $400,000 a mile. Our mill and fill, which would be to take off 1.5 inches, put on another 1.5 inches, is again in round numbers, maybe double that. If we are looking at a full reclamation, right? So bringing it down to gravel, stabilizing the subbase, we're probably talking $1.5 million plus a mile. So I think to your point, Senator, the delta between keeping a good road good, letting it deteriorate to a place where the subbase and the underlying structural structure is gone. I mean, it's basically 5 times more expensive in round numbers.
so if I pave it, it's 300 a mile,
Well, preservation treatment. So that's like,
300,000 a month.
yeah,
And then it's anywhere in between that up to $1.5 million a mile if I have to deal with the sub base.
correct.
in that.
And it can fall depending on the treatment anywhere in there. But that's a general suite of options that we have.
Wendy and then
So, some roads were not built very well to start with, which, so that makes it much more difficult.
Correct.
So, I mean, there's several of those in my area,
Mhm.
and I think V-Trans has, mostly, got when you redo them, you actually do base, because there are roads that don't even have base.
Correct.
And it's, you know,
No, there's a huge section of the state network that has just evolved over time.
right, right.
Over
And
the 20th century, let's say, it's just sort of evolved. There's been various efforts over time, so in some places we put concrete slabs in, and now we're going back, and that's that
Yeah.
right? We've taken some of those out and used sub-base stabilization methods to sort of improve that structure. But you're right, the fully engineered roads are pretty much limited to like Super 7, the interstates, places where we've really built something in the last, let's say 30 or 40 years. Everything else is sort of taken what was there and tried to make it as viable as possible.
right, the cobblestones under there,
Mhm.
so it really is more of a challenge. So is
Yeah.
there a goal to upgrade all of those roads? I mean, that would be a
Yeah, I don't think
huge-
that's viable.
Okay.
I mean, again, I live on Route 12. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll never be clean that. It just doesn't make sense. There's not enough
Yeah.
traffic. So I think that's just what we're gonna have to keep accepting is that, and that's where some of these roads will probably never really get to that fully good status and stay there very long. We'll just sort of acknowledge that they're low traffic roads, there's alternative routes, and we'll pave them every 15 or 20 years, whether they need it or not.
But they will probably need it more often, so to your point about pavement.
Well-
And pavement is getting better. I mean,
Yeah, and
they
that-
are making it more ecologically.
Oh, absolutely. We're using the cycle products more. The plants are much more efficient. So yeah, the carbon footprint of a mile of paving is definitely different today than it was 20 years ago.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate this conversation quite a bit, and obviously I have strong perspectives on paving, largely because I think it is so hyper-focused on a very specific way of traveling. It's a single car or a single truck traveling alone from one place to another. That is who paving at this level is serving as a demographic. And unfortunately, that demographic has been hyper prioritized in our transportation system in the United States for the last 50 years, versus there's a plethora of other ways you can get from point A to point B in our state. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about pavement preservation options that aren't us doing expensive work. I mean, my understanding is we can have, again, fewer cars on the road. That would save us substantial paving costs because we have less damage. As you put it, there's some roads where you don't even need to pave them every 15 or 20 years because there's just less traffic.
Yeah.
So if people were carpooling, if they were using the train, I know you think it's funny, but
No,
We don't
I'm
have-
not laughing at you.
Oh,
I'm
you're
laughing
looking for
at a
that.
text.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's
Sorry. Yeah, my phone is connected to me like an organ in my body,
Oh,
and
we
I.
have a bill for that.
And I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It was my phone. That was not.
That's fine. I guess my point was just like, I think it's unfortunate that we are looking so directly at this conversation without addressing the fact that we've underfunded train travel, public transportation, or bike and ped infrastructure, which could see significant savings here. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to work that the agency has done to
Sure.
help reduce and do that pavement preservation without continuing to overpave our road.
Right. So, a couple points there. I think absent any vehicular traffic, right? So public transit, carpooling, they're still dependent on the network, right? The network doesn't fundamentally become less important because you're in a bus versus a single occupancy vehicle. The other point I would say is what we hear from our customers, right? The 600,000 Vermonters, is that they expect the network to be maintained at some level of good repair. And that's who we serve. I would also add, as it relates to bike and ped, we have a bike and ped program, but that is only a portion of the bike and ped investment. So there is a significant investment within the paving program for bike and ped that we don't necessarily extract. We have gone back and looked at it sort of in totality, because every project we put forward, we do look at it, widened shoulders, added sidewalks, whatever the feature is. And I want to say, that's in the tens of millions of dollars that's largely unaccounted for, that are buried either in the roadway program or the paving program, just as a matter of course. A good example of that would be out here, but we just did a reclaim on Route 2, and the shoulders are significantly wider now than they were pre-project. And again, that was largely a bike and ped consideration. Obviously, the safety of the traveling public, or vehicular traveling public, was a consideration as well. But that certainly made Route 2 a much more viable ped or bike route than it was previously.
Okay, I appreciate that. So you're saying you spend tens of millions of dollars that we don't see in the budget as like a line item, but that does support biking.
Yeah, every project we look at has a bike and ped consideration, right?
Okay.
Now, if you're in Norton on 114, that's a different consideration than perhaps 302 between Barre and Montpelier, right? So it is context specific, but every project we advance, we at least look at it. And very frequently you'll see wider shoulders after we do a project. And that is largely focused on bike ped accommodation.
I think for me to support any more money going to paving, I would need to also understand how we're actually doing this work. And it sounds like I would have to do a lot of individual research to pull that out. So I'm wondering if we could ask the agency to share with us what percentage of projects meet complete street standards, which is, I think, what you're describing.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Right. I mean, so it's a consideration, but we don't necessarily bring it to full complete streets, right? But within our project development process, most paving projects now originate with what's called a new project summary, and bike and ped is okay. This is anticipated bike ped usage, and that's where like 14 in Norton obviously doesn't get the same consideration as elsewhere. So and that's where it's just part of what we do. That's likewise for any roadway project, likewise for any bridge project. This is just something we build into our network at this point.
Yeah, it would be helpful to get that teased out because I'm trying to make a case for us reducing our costs for paving, not by continuing to pave, but by reducing the depletion of our pavement, which I think is another way to do it. It's like instead of having to continue to pay for higher costs, it's we need to use it less and we need to conserve, make up, use it, wear it out.
Yeah.
That's the ethos that I'm going for. So the only other point I wanted to raise, which I totally appreciate, is that you have a consumer public who has an expectation. I think that expectation would be very different if people had alternative ways to get from point A to point B that were safe. You would be less angry about the road condition if you could pop on a train that could take you from point A to point B. You'd be much less angry about the road condition if you could walk safely to your destination versus having to get in your car. You'd be much less concerned about the road condition if you felt like you weren't in a situation that was dangerous to be in a small car versus a really big car. I mean, there's all sorts of changes that we could make that could lower this cost by just making behavioral changes amongst Vermonters. And I do hope that we think about that as well in our paving budgets, because this is a lot of money. So there you go.
Can
That's my
we-
point.
I just want to follow up on
Yeah.
just a little
We
bit.
will, and
Okay.
then, but I would like to get to the bridge and visual.
Sure, it's just, complete streets, Senator White, I think we could do a lot better on complete streets because, multiple reasons, so I'll just leave it at that for now.
Right.
And, because we could have more public, understanding and have decision points where we could include bike. I'm particularly concerned about how we deal with transit. We don't have transit stops. So we can definitely do better on that, in my opinion. And I had a bill last year, and I'm happy to work with you.
Hey, I got a Bill Kurtz bill already, 75, that's 75, that's complete streets in there.
Okay, but let's talk about detail.
If we could
Yes.
let you finish your.
Sure,
report,
yeah,
and then
yeah. I would just add, my guess, not guess, my educated assumption here is that the majority of the failures and distress we see in our pavements are not single occupancy vehicles, right? It is environmental factors like heaving or the larger trucks, right? And it's free or something like that. So not to be argumentative, but I don't think, even if we cut single occupancy vehicles usage in half, I don't know that our pavement conditions would actually change drastically at this point, just because they're not heavy enough really to sort of impart structural damage in comparison to everything else. Like you said, Senator, like they're just not on engineered roadways at this point. So,
let's move into, we've got for half an hour.
sure, okay. So again, I think
What? Okay,
so I think a lot of you jumped ahead, but here's sort of the historic paving miles over time. So bridge inventory, and this will be focused on the long structures, which are 20 feet or more. We also have short structures, which are 6 to 20 feet. But from a federal highway requirement, they really focus on the long structures. So we've got a little over 2,800 structures in Vermont that are over 20 feet. 1,100 of those are on beat ban zone roads. Of that 1,100, 300 are on the interstate. And then there's almost 1,700 that are town highways or privately owned and maintained. So our bridge inspectors go out and inspect the bridges, and we inspect all long and short and state shorts every other year at a minimum. And depending on the condition, we can reduce that frequency. we look at three components of the bridge and give it a 0 to 10 rating. The deck, which is the concrete surface that you see, the superstructure, which is the beams underneath that actually hold up the deck, and then the substructure, which is your abutments and wing walls and things like that. And so this is a good fair pour in conformance with federal highway. Good is rating 7 to 9, fair is 5 to 6, and a poor is 0 to 4. And basically the bridge is rated at whatever the lowest score is of that superstructure and substructure. So if you had a deck that was a 4, but the superstructure and substructure were 6s, it would still be rated a 4. Anything rated a 4 or less will be inspected at least annually, and then potentially even more frequently. The performance measures are not based on actual bridges. It's the square foot area of the deck. So again, the size of the bridge does have an influence on our total targets. So this is essentially what we're looking at for a projection going forward for the interstate lawns. And what we see is actually pretty good conditions out there. I will say that, as I said previously, bridges are going to be less reactive to either investments or a reduction in investments just because of the life cycle. So basically, we're looking at trying to get 75 to 100 years out of a bridge. We can not invest at a certain level for a longer period of time, and it doesn't necessarily show up as immediately. The converse of that is true, however, as well, in that if we let the bridges deteriorate, it's significantly more expensive and it takes a lot longer to bring them back than, say, paving does. So, yeah, what we see is at current funding levels of $103 million, we see a fairly consistent target on the interstate. Again, that's expected. And really, we'd have to go further out to see the full impacts of that. State bridge condition, we've got a target of 10% in poor condition.
Go ahead, Andy.
Just, can I ask why the different percentage? I noticed I looked ahead in the slide, like
Sure.
supposedly the
Yeah.
rating goes higher. Is it just because there's less travel and
Less important, I would say, right? So if the town highway is reduced or, is getting closed, there's less of an impact on the overall network than an interstate bridge. So the emphasis there is to have less bridges in poor condition.
Can I be a little cynical?
Sure.
You're chasing federal dollars.
Well, so in both pavements and bridges, there are federal.
Amount of money, and you want to keep your numbers up for overall piece. A 90-10 is easier to make than an 80-20.
That is true, but it actually isn't the driver. What I'll say is if we let either the pavement condition or the bridge conditions drop below federal performance targets for either paving or bridge on the NHS, they will tell us to invest on the NHS.
Yeah.
Without,
And
right. So,
that is coupled with the fact that
Yeah.
you get a higher match.
yes, 100%. I mean,
Sorry, that was
no, and to
just
some
my
extent,
cynical view.
and I guess what I would say is when we're looking which targets to postpone, if we have a transportation fund shortfall, that is certainly a consideration. But when we program projects, it isn't.
No, I get it.
Okay. So here's the state bridge conditions. Again, 10% in poor condition is the target. You can see it's creeping up a little bit, but overall we're still meeting that target over the out years. Very similar type of graph for the town bridge condition. 12% is the target, and again we're projecting to meet that in the out years. I think that's it.
Mr. Chair.
Pat and then
So when we're programming for state bridges, I'm looking at right now. And where did I see? Thought I just saw 9%.
Those
Was that?
towns up to 9.
Okay, that's what I was looking at,
Yep.
town. And it creeps up to 9, 2031, then it kind of like levels out. Why? That's with the same level of program, of monies that you're throwing out year after year, level funding.
Yes. So, my guess is that, so these are percentage of square foot. And so if we are anticipating completing a bridge in 2032, let's say, we expect that to be coming off the network or vice versa. And maybe I need to explain sort of how these deterioration curves work. So these we adjust more frequently. And basically what we do is we say, okay, based on a certain structure type, we anticipate if it's rated a 5, it will stay as a 5 for 6 years, let's say, and then it'll drop down as a 4. So it's a little bit less scientific and more historical practice driven. So to go from 2030 to 2031, there might be 2 or 3 bridges that are sort of hitting that anticipated shelf of we expect them to drop from a 5 to a 4 in that inspection cycle.
So should we expect to see the town bridge program in say 2031 increase because we know there's going to be 9% back to town, but
Right. So,
or any,
yeah,
really.
I mean, it's a little bit tough to say that for sure. As I look at, 2030, 2031 here on the interstate, we're at our target. So short answer, maybe not, because even at 9%, we're still well below our target of 12%. But on the interstate condition, we would be at the target at that point. And again, Federal Highway says you will meet your targets or we will direct you to invest in the NHS system. So I don't think we could alter the proportion to towns to get them to the same level.
I'm not saying bring them down to the 6%.
No.
Just what I'm like, say in the, I hate to make you keep jumping around.
No.
Say you go back to the interstate system and we're at the target now.
Yep.
And we're at it in 2031 and we continue to stay there. But just being added, that's a federal, that's 6% is set by the feds.
That's our target.
What's
The feds are 10%.
Theirs is 10.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I think we would, let's just say that it plays out and I'm in 2030 and trying to put together that FY 2031 budget. I probably wouldn't raise the town highway bridge program just because we're still 3% below our target. And there is no federal target for the town highway bridge program or town highway bridges. So I wouldn't want to, if I had to pick resources, I wouldn't want to take money out of either, the state or the interstate bridge program.
I just get a little paranoid when I see us getting close to the target because we spent a lot of time crawling under bridges with a committee a few years ago and looking at what really happens underneath the bridge instead of on top of it.
Right.
And it's scary.
And that's where I think, the fact that we're able to basically be at or below the target on the interstates is reflective of that investment. And as I started out, what isn't reflected here is any of those culverts that may become bridges, when we replace them. And we've got to find money within the interstate system, obviously Richmond's the most recent example to replace those culverts. And those aren't reflected in these numbers.
Thank you.
So just
Go ahead.
local lore has it that Irene brought our total bridge system into a much better condition after FEMA.
So without a doubt, for all the tragedy that the flooding has caused, the probably singular upside there is we have probably replaced, I'll just guess, 100 bridges on the state system without using any formula funds.
Wow.
And so, even in our budget, so this is predicting I think $103 million investment, which would be the FY26 investment minus the federal ER money, which I think is like 58 million. So I think our budget this year is 161, but 58 of that is federal highway ER money.
Okay. But then we're benefiting from what happened 11 years ago.
Absolutely, right? If we look at the,
Bridges are.
yeah, if we look at Hurricane Irene, flooding in 23 and flooding in 24, we've effectively been able to replace 100 bridges without touching any of our formula funds. Now, most of those did have a state fund match, so it wasn't free.
Oh, they did, okay.
Yeah, but they did not affect our normal formula funding from federal highway.
Okay, great.
Hey, we're a little early.
I'm happy to have more angry questions.
Go ahead. You got somebody here? Go ahead.
Oh, okay, hey. So you mentioned earlier that you believe that the weight of the passenger vehicles would not actually, even if we got rid of half of them on the road, that wouldn't likely have an impact on our pavement quality. I'm wondering if you have any research or anything that I could kind of get
Right.
information on that with, because I totally want to trust your perspective. It's an expert in the field, but I'd love to be able to do some of my.
Right. So as I said, I'm not aware of any scientific research, but just looking at the roadways and the failure mechanisms that we're seeing, it isn't generally based on single occupancy vehicles, right? We see a lot of environmental factors, right? So as we discussed earlier, you get the heaving, you get a crack, you get water in there, it goes for a freeze thaw. That's probably one of the single biggest issues. And then obviously the larger trucks, you've got 80 to 90,000 pound vehicles. I don't know what a single occupancy vehicle weighs, but it's not much compared to that. And so when we talk about like the actual structural breakdown of the road, now there are some surface roughness stuff that happens just by sheer volume. But as far as actually like true damage to the roadway, it's probably not your single occupancy vehicle, sedan type thing. It is probably your trucks and probably more importantly, it's the environmental factor.
Do we have any place that you would recommend someone who wants to learn more about this topic where they would go to find that information?
There's all kinds of academic studies that could talk about pavement design, NCHRP, so National Cooperative Highway Research Program, TRB, Transportation Research Board. There's all kinds of research that goes on. I will say when we design a roadway, what we use is what's called an easel, which is an equivalent single axle load. And, that's again, where the trucks have a disproportionate impact, right? If you take a 8,000 pound vehicle compared to an 80,000 pound vehicle, not only are you having a heavier load, but you've got more axles as well. And so, just sort of knowing how these numbers play out, again, I don't know that we've ever, done a lot of studies on it, and given the number of variables, I think it would be tough to academically prove absent a trial, right? You'd almost have to say in some controlled environment, right, this is what it is, because you do have, environmental factors, and it'd be very difficult under a public roadway scenario to say, okay, we are going to reduce the single occupancy vehicles by half and see what happens. But there's no way to really replicate that on a public highway because you can't, limit the number of vehicles on the roadway.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking I'd love to do some research. I think when we think about train travel, for example, and you talk about the really large trucks, why aren't we doing more freight? We have Freightline in our state that if we could reduce even, it sounds like some of that travel, we could reduce our costs when it comes to paving. So I guess, has AOT ever done any kind of overarching look at what other factors besides physically paving things we could do to reduce our need? Or to reduce degradation?
To the level of detail you're looking at, I don't know that we have, right? If we were to sort of say, whatever, we build out rail corridors, essentially is what you're sort of asking.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've ever said like, okay, if we connected, whatever, pick a town, Morrisville to Montpelier with a rail line, what does that do to Route 12? I don't think we've ever looked at that. No, right? You know, I would offer that paving Route 12 is probably cheaper than building a rail line, but I don't know that we've ever run those scenarios. Maybe on the Western Corridor, we're looking at, just because we have spent significant money on the Western Corridor for the rail line, you know, I'm trying to bring passenger rail there. And, you know, we may have done some studies to look at the reduction in traffic on Route 7 or 22A for that matter. But I don't know that we've then been able to extrapolate what that actually meant for pavement life as a result of the build out of the Western Corridor.
Yeah, it's just, I think that that's kind of the conversations we're gonna have to start having, especially as we have fewer resources available to us and cost increases with tariffs. I mean, all of this stuff is gonna get more expensive. So I think we're at an inflection point where we need to think really creatively, and also set expectations for the average road user as well. Unfortunately, I mean, I haven't heard a proposal for us to increase revenue to address what I think you've identified as a very serious problem, which is our roads are going to degrade over the next 10 years without a big influx of
I
cash.
would just say,
You know, I think that is a problem.
I don't think it's only here. I think we started here. For me, let me talk about the overall in the vision.
Yeah.
When you talk about construction, it's paving and it's bridges, and it's somewhat easier to quantify those. In transportation, we have public transit, we have rail, we have air, we have, in the public transit system, we're trying to, I put in my mind those in a block. And then we have maintenance of the system, which is in a block. And then we've got town programs that are in these blocks. I think what you're seeing a start of is with flat revenues and with declining revenues that we're up against. There is no money to cut in bridge and paving.
Exactly.
To produce for transit. There is no money, I think, in maintenance to cut, to put in transit.
Exactly.
And I think the town programs, you know, this budget that we put together is less money to towns than previously. And I think towns are facing the same. I think what we're trying in the overall here to do is in each of the areas, be able to say to people out in the state and our colleagues, we're sucking wind. And it's across the board, and there is no money. And we can't, I think with this budget, you look at it and it's really hard to say I could cut paving to be able to produce for public transit. And I think that's all part of making the case to be able to say to people, you know, I am going to say this again. For me, when I look at sitting in this chair, it's the same group of us, which I hope it all is next year, sitting here to put together a budget in all of those areas. I don't know how to do it. And I don't know how we're going to do it and not leave all of transportation, from public transit to construction, to the maintenance of our highways, to handing money back to the towns to help them with this. And I don't know how we hand that off and not hand off a system that is in worse shape than we're inheriting.
Bingo, exactly. And so I think you kind of have three options at that point. It's either one, we make a case for a revenue increase somewhere as a committee or House does. And that could just continue the status quo or improve it slightly from what Jeremy said. The second, so that's option one, is more revenue to help resolve this. The second option is no new revenue, status quo, we end up with the picture you've outlined for us, or worse. Or the third option, which is what I've been trying to articulate throughout this meeting, is or we strategically make investments in places that could reduce the impacts on our pavement. You know, that's the other angle to this is this trend is either we're gonna have to start investing in new revenue sources and make that case to Vermonters that they have to pay more to maintain what they have or less. Or we need to set expectations that it's going to be worse and we're just going to have to accept that. Or we make big investments today to lower the impact that bad pavement and poor roads will have on people by having alternatives. I mean, that's kind of the decision matrix I'm seeing. And I've introduced a revenue proposal with the delivery fee, but I'm not aware of another revenue proposal coming from our legislative branch or the administration. So besides purchase and use, but coming out of the ed fund, but I haven't even. So I don't know. Do you want to direct us to do something on this? Or do
I
you have
think we're building a case here, and I don't think you build a case. I have to say to you, and I'll say this and Pat was on the committee. It took us 5 years to deal. And the TIP on fund was the culmination of a 5-year process of building a case. And I think we have to quantify where our needs are, what they are, and where we want to go and articulate that to the public. And I think this is all part of it. And I will say at this point, Jeremy, thank you for being here. I think this was helpful for us and it will help stimulate a conversation. And at that, Megan, I think